Hello and welcome to another episode of the Testing Peers podcast. It's been a long time since we've all been together, but the Fab Four are back all together for tonight. I'm here with David.
Hello.
Chris.
Greetings.
Russell.
Good day.
And I'm Simon. We are delighted that Saffron QA continue to sponsor the podcast. Saffron QA is a specialist in testing recruitment, offering permanent, contract and a newly developed retained recruitment service. More details can be found in the show notes, or please reach out to Ben directly to find out more. It's been a while since we've said this, but Chris, banter, over to you.
Hello. Now, we're talking today about things like planning and estimation, which Simon may or may not have mentioned, listener, but don't worry, I got you back. So I've been thinking about things that I have enjoyed researching when I wanted to go and get something new for myself, or if I was buying a nice gift for someone else. And I wanted to just sort of know how you three maybe like to sort of invest in your research for things that you're really interested in, be it your favorite football shirt or a new mobile phone or a vacation or anything like that. I'm a bit of a sucker for a Trello board and an Excel sheet, I'll be honest with you. Has anyone got any interesting tales of where they maybe spent a little bit too much time and effort into researching something before buying it? I can see Russell. I'm thinking kit cars.
Yeah, I was thinking the same for him.
Yes, there was lots of research into kit cars. I'm an analyst, I guess, is what the way I view myself. So kit cars, spreadsheets, houses, spreadsheets, multiple pages, lots of sort of filters and all sorts of different things to calculate cost-benefit analyses and all sorts. But massive spreadsheets of just numbers and calculations and what the rates would be for this versus that and so on. I like a good spreadsheet and I like a lot of data. I like values, costs, and all sorts. But yes, I worked out exactly how much it would cost me to build a car with every manufacturer of Cobras. So yes, I'm a stats data guy.
I think I'm also a spreadsheet person. A spreadsheet is always a good place to start. However, I'm not quite as detailed as Russell. But generally, how my search sort of criteria is, I will scan the internet and look for the best sort of thing, and then I'll probably write it down in an Excel spreadsheet, and then just pause for a minute and actually consider whether I actually need it or want it, or what the best value is to me. You know, is it next day delivery, or is it, you know, paying extra for whatever, and then decide in that way. I do have friends who have, for various things, produce a PowerPoint presentation for making decisions, but I haven't personally yet gone down that route.
I have the tendency to shoot from the hip with buying things, which is not always the best idea. But for things like holidays, for big purchases, I won't quite go to the length of a spreadsheet, but I might go to the length of reading all the reviews. So let's say for a holiday home, and this came back to bite us this year with our holiday. We spent ages reviewing loads of houses where we wanted to go in Bournemouth, reviewing loads of houses on Airbnb, looking at all the reviews, whether they were special host or not, or whatever the category is. And then we found this one. We somehow turned the filters all off. No special host, no nothing else. Found this house that we ended up going to. All the reviews were good. Everything was positive. And then, so we made the purchase. And then a couple of months later, all the negative reviews started filing in. And then obviously what happened on holiday was it was a complete disaster. So we've had that kind of experience, but I do tend to, when I'm buying stuff, I will read reviews, which is something that sometimes causes a bit of frustration in this household, because I will hold off buying things because I haven't read the reviews yet. Or I'll say after something's been bought, well, didn't you check these reviews? There's a few reviews here that aren't very good. And then that causes anxiety and panic in the household of, well, we shouldn't have bought it. So then it's like, well, maybe we shouldn't have read the reviews. So I do tend to like reading the reviews, but I guess you probably got that from this message. That's probably, I don't go as far as spreadsheets, but I do like to find out what other people have thought of it.
You gave the example where there are some negative reviews. Have you found that the opposite is effect? You said they had negative reviews and that reinforced your bias. Have you had read negative reviews and actually then realized actually the product you bought was actually quite good, and those negative reviews are not.
There's always those things where some people find a reason to complain for something when actually there's nothing wrong with the product. Yes, lots of cases with stuff, especially Amazon purchases. I'm trying to think of one recently since we've moved house, but there's been a few where we've bought new stuff for the house. In fact, these floating shelves that I've got on the wall, I think I read the reviews for those, and it was like, oh, they're really complex to put on the wall and all this kind of stuff. And actually, yeah, a couple of screws, they're up. So
perspective is an interesting one, isn't it?
It is.
Reviews are always those. It depends on your view and your opinion. What's hard for you is different to another person.
So many parallels of things. I think that for me, it's normally sort of technology-based purchases. I will go in depth. I will read reviews, maybe not as many as Simon, but I will also do the spreadsheets and I will look for the best prices. These days, I watch a few YouTube reviews from folks that I respect.
Is that Ryan?
Not Ryan, no. He only reviews toys. That's not generally where I'm aiming with my tech purchases, but things like phones, cameras, TVs, ovens, washing machines, all the exciting stuff. I like to sort of get a feel for those things rather than going into a showroom or being blinded by XYZ. I kind of have I work out a list of sort of my non-negotiables, things that I'd like, but also work out my ceiling for a price that I'd want to pay. And then you sort of do your research to see who's going to do a flash sale and when, and all these other tidbits. Like I was once in the queue at Drayton Manor when the phone I wanted to get went on a flash sale, and so they're really ignoring my family. I was given permission, thankfully, because I told my wife what I was trying to do and how much money I was going to save. It saved £300 on a mobile phone by getting a flash sale, so it was worth it. But there was a mad panic trying to make sure I got there before the. I mean, I was a complete sucker for the flash sale, but at the same point, I did save money. So, but yeah, lots and lots of time investing in things that aren't necessarily important to other people, but it's important to me. I hate the feeling like I've made a mistake buying something, spending my own money on stuff, because I also don't like returning stuff.
Yes,
so I really want to get it right. I don't want to have to return it.
There's a whole rabbit hole we could go down talking about returning things,
or just keeping something and willing it to be all right.
I think that's banned for another episode.
Yes, I think you're right.
Let's move on to some sort of planning and estimation. Russell, do you want to tell us where this idea came from?
So we had a message on Twitter from one of our followers, Joe Richards, who was asking us a question a little bit about some story points and user stories. So they recently tweeted something themselves and found that there was actually quite a diverse response. So they're asking kind of us a little bit about what our views were around story points, stories, and user stories in general. So why don't we share how we think about story points, stories, user stories, and estimations and things of that ilk?
I think it's probably a common thought, or at least I thought it was a common thought, is story points can be very subjective, and it is very much down to, depends on its audience that you're using it, whether people can really be that abstract about something, because there's always this dying need in teams to, what does one story point mean? How many days, how many hours does one story point equate to? And then you lose the value of story points straight away. It's very difficult to keep that going in a very positive line as soon as you refer it back to actual time lengths.
Probably shouldn't.
Well, exactly. I've never worked in a team where they've used story points effectively. As I've said in previous episodes, I've never really worked in a fully agile way. Teams that pay lip service to it, but never really fully committed to everything around it. So the story points thing is never something that's ever really, really sort of hit the mark. We've always done, 6 hours a day, referred to sprint time estimates. And in more recent times, it's been even further away from story points. It's been more about, how is it 0.5 of a resource for how many weeks do we need to do this piece of work, and all that kind of estimation, which is horrible. and we're trying to move away from that again now, thankfully. So yeah, I've not got great stories to tell about story points, but it's certainly a useful if it's used properly.
I've seen a couple of really bad practices with story points, seeing as we're running with the bad stories to start with. We can talk about like good things and thoughts later, but I once saw a project manager come in, and he was trained by the senior project manager on how to understand story points and the very complex algorithm that had been worked out by the senior project manager for X number of story points equals X amount of time, and therefore everything the backlog equals this amount of time, and that is when the project will be delivered. That was one example. Another one which I actually think is more dangerous, because the other one is kind of just stupid and whatever. The one that I saw was more dangerous is I worked in a company where 5 Scrum teams worked on the same code base, and they demoed collectively off the same main branch at the end of every sprint cycle. And they were all expected to use the exact same benchmark for each and every story, regardless of complexity, available skill, any of these sorts of things. And then there was this competition between, well, this team delivered this many story points, that team delivered that many story points, completely defeating the object of a story point, which I understand we haven't really explained what we understand a story point to be at this point. But what I can tell you is the story points are there for the team, not for the other people attending demos. And so I would much rather, in terms of demos, that points aren't even talked about, quite frankly, because it became toxic and unhelpful.
You're demoing the work, not, it's got no reflection or
and
relationship to it.
Metrics and numbers, Russell, they're very, 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 very easy to report on and to just think that is the measure by which I'm doing these. And there were literally people, hippos and the like, highest paid people in the organization, who only saw that number and then would think Team X was out delivering Team Y just because they saw 30 story points versus 12 or whatever. And the damage that is done with those things is very, very high.
It's the same with any measure, isn't it? It's the same with one team is delivering more lines of code than another team, therefore that team must be more productive. But actually,
you're talking about Twitter now, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly.
But is it worth trying to define, or someone finding a resource on what story points are actually there to do, what the point of them are? Is that something that's
Why
worth
don't we give
covering?
our kind of summary and see if we all kind of come to a consensus?
Do that and then find a definitive thing, perhaps.
Well, I think you'll never find a definitive thing, because there isn't really.
You mean there's one true story point Scrum guide?
Okay, there's Wikipedia, but so it's a relative estimation sizing technique based on comparing things based upon teams usually, and often using practices such as planning poker to avoid anchoring and other biases. It's based on the concept that 2 people won't take the exact same amount of time to do a bit of work, but can agree it's in relation that is equivalent of 1 unit or 5 units or whatever method you want to do. Generally, it uses a Fibonacci sequence, because obviously as complexity grows and numbers grow, your accuracy reduces. So you don't try and have 1, 2, 3 to 99. It also saves time by not trying to be accurate when you can't be. So obviously teams use that, but what you generally try and do is, as a team or group, agree a collective understanding of a story or several stories in order to make a baseline that you can then relatively estimate against. Is that bigger, smaller? And then you can do the relative sizing against it. That's how I would basically describe story points in a nutshell. Agree, disagree? Want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty solid. Do you want to possibly touch into velocity or burn down and the sort of the goal of getting better at estimating?
Well, one of the things that stories points can give you is things like velocity. So you can understand how many points you can achieve in a sprint or a time box period, depending on what you're doing, so that then you can compare velocities of your team over a period of time with your velocity grows. Obviously, if your baseline changes, your velocity becomes new. It changes as well. So if, for example, you change which stories you're relatively estimating against, you have to redo your velocity. But also every team generally will have a different baseline because they're working on different stories. So story points are generally team specific. You can't compare one team to another team, one area to another area, because their baselines are different. If you do happen to have a miracle and you have multiple teams agree the same baselines, then in theory you can compare it across them in the sense of their velocity going up or down. You can't compare 20 points done by this team to 20 points done by this team, but obviously you can compare the trends. So their velocity improvements up and down versus anything else, because one team could have 6 senior people in it, 3 junior people in it, and so on. So the baselines and velocities will not be directly comparable.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing is even a slight change to a team where one person is switched out can completely alter their story points. That could, you got someone else, different opinions coming in for the estimation, and the velocity will be different. Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, it's very easy for people above and along on the outside to look at Scrum teams and think, well, hang on, that team's delivering more value than this team because they're doing more story points. But it could be the size makeup's different. It could be the skill sets different. It could be the work they're doing is more complex, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many factors around it.
But this is, I guess, the thing about good Scrum Masters, coaches.
Yes, absolutely.
Should be challenging those leaders. Part of the job of an Agile Scrum Master or an Agile coach in many ways is to kind of inform, help, coach, mentor, prevent some of the abuses I think we've already started talking about. Because like any system, it can be abused, it can be misused, and it is dangerous, just as bad as time is.
Yes.
So it's one of those things. I have a personal love of story points. I've seen it used in lots of teams very well, and also to enable release planning, long-term big sprints and all the rest of it. It's been very successful where I've worked because I've been able to extrapolate everyone's independent views of time. So it's been able to kind of get broad averages versus detailed, one person does half a point a day type things. It's in a sprint, we do 40. And I've had teams that do 40 points in a sprint and teams that do 120 because their bases are different. And that's fine. Doesn't mean one's better than the other. It just means that, okay, in a 2-week period, they roughly get through 120 points. So in 3 sprints, if we're lucky, they'll get through 360. If we're lucky, because again, it's an average. It's not set in stone. It doesn't mean they'll exactly get through 360. Most sprints and most time boxes, you get most stories done if you've got good patterns. So some things might overrun. But again, it's about taking things with a pinch of salt. Precision is the enemy here. You can't be that precise. That's the whole point. So rather than spending weeks and days for precision, spend less time on precision and use the law of average. There was something I did, which was, and I've seen other people do this, which is skip the story points altogether and just count how many tickets. And actually, you can use the velocity of how many tickets a team can achieve. If tickets are relatively similar sizes, so no one takes huge things and tiny things, you can average out that, and you can actually work out how many sprints, again, it'll take to get through 100 tickets. Team does, and one of my worlds was between 18 and 22. Over about 4 sprints, that's what they were consistently doing. So I took the average there of 20. It's quite easy for the maths. I could see that roughly in 4 sprints, they'd do 80 tickets, assuming the backlog was a reflection, again, of a mixed group. So there's some assumptions you have to make, but it's just as accurate as any other estimate you're going to do.
There's always a problem with those things, isn't there? With like gamification and people saying, right, if our team is measured by those numbers, that and we are expected to deliver blah blah blah, that they could play the system.
Yeah. You look for consistency though, rather than constantly trying to micromanage into improvements that 20
hope so.
need 21, need 22, need 23 every sprint. Got to go back.
There's a division, isn't there, which we've touched upon a few times, about the people who are actually doing the work and the people who are maybe consuming or expecting the work for those
paying
bits.
for it.
And I think there's always been that split in any company between those who are trying to work in an agile way of working and those who have to work in a very much more linear project delivery kind of cycle. And that's tough.
Well, I was just going to reiterate that I agree with the story points. You know, Russell was saying about one group being having 120 or achieving 120, that sometimes there can be that competitive edge and it needs to be taken away from that concept of we're so much better than you. We're three, the people who have been doing 40, we're 3 times better. No, it's the concept of the story point is a different benchmark, because you could just triple the other one and have the same amount. Every group has a different benchmark. And as we've discussed before in Agile, the whole point of Agile is that each team create their own structure almost immediately that they've actually been created. So that story points should be just specific to that time. And if they move to a different project, then again, it's a negotiation of what is perceived to be the story point. And I also agree that I think that the big mismatch is the difference between story points and time. There is people are very eager. They want to measure it against something, because having an abstract story point, sometimes people don't cope with that.
Yeah.
So the easiest coping strategy is to add time to it. And unfortunately, that sort of breaks it down, because as soon as you don't achieve your point for a half a day, then the system's broken, for whatever reason. It's just a more complex thing. And so therefore, that again needs to be picked up as part of the Agile and reconsidered. And again, that comes back to the Scrum Master or whoever's running that particular project to make sure that that is broken down, those misconceptions.
If you move to using time, like say a point half a day, you might as well just start using time. Yes. There is no point. You're just kind of doing it for the appearance.
You're adding extra layers onto it then, because then you're going to have to explain to everyone when you're presenting stuff. Oh, well, in our world, one story point is half a day.
Yeah.
It adds an and actually just
it corrupts the team as well.
It does. Just searching story points on Google, you get the list of questions come up, and the list of questions are: how many hours is one story point? How many hours is 3 story points? Is 0.5 story points okay? How many days is 2 story points? Are all the questions there? And it's just like,
who knows?
People are craving to have that understanding of what a story point means, but the ultimate is it is a unit of measurement that's used to determine how much effort is required to complete a product backlog item. It doesn't matter.
This is the thing. Effort is trying to incorporate into it physical effort. So sometimes that's part of time, because that's what we consume into effort, but also risk, uncertainty, knowledge, gaps, things that we have to consider outside of that. I try and use things like traveling as a kind of analogy to describe it. Like traveling to your local shops, how certain of you how long it's going to take? Quite certain. Traveling to the biggest city nearby, you get a bit more harder because you've got different travel mechanisms. How you get there might be different. Actually, I might take the bus depending on the traffic times of it and things. Oh, I might get this bus rather than that bus. But then, and you extrapolate to cities, going like cross country. Like for me, going to London, the complexity and the more things going on there, that is so much more times complicated than me traveling to Peterborough or somewhere else. And if you try and extrapolate that into numbers, just relative scales, me going to the shop is tiny, 0.05. Me going to the nearest city is maybe a 2, because it's not that far still for me.
I think the other level of complexity, if you add complexity into the mix there, you may have a 2-hour journey that requires 6 tube changes or 6 train changes. You might also have a 2-hour journey that is straight down a motorway in a car, and you don't have to do anything challenging.
And you might have a train strike.
Well, that as well.
The other thing I was going to say with that analogy is the fact that the length of the journey or the distance of the journey is also the planning time as well as part of that.
Everything gets more complicated.
You can just get your shoes on and pop there. Traveling to London, you have to take those considerations, like you say, the strike. Am I getting in the car? What time of day am I going? There is a lot more planning time that's associated with that. So it isn't just a simple thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of comparing them. This journey is twice this journey. This journey is, and that's why you try and pick stories as reference points. You don't just go for a 1-pointer, because what's 13 points compared to 1? It's very hard to imagine 13 times 1 in terms of effort. So you try and pick things that are maybe a 1 or a 2, something you can go half higher and something higher. And I feel like I'm going into a coaching session now, but never mind. But if you pick the wrong baseline, it's even harder for your teams to get their heads around it, because I couldn't tell you what kind of 13 times more effort or 10 times more effort than a 1-pointer type thing. It's very hard to do.
And actually the granularity is a really key thing, making sure that particular level is correct.
There's also the question of, if you have a story and you're estimating points, are you estimating test effort as well?
Ooh, should be
So
all
just-
effort. Now, in the ideal world, it's release to production effort. If you can do CD, particularly, that's what it should be. But you'll compromise this somewhere and have into master or something else. But I definitely think the minimum you should expect is dev and test effort to a certain agreed point.
So the follow-on to that is, do the tools that we use every day that are agile actually help us in this process, or are they making a rod for our backs?
I think they direct you down a certain way of doing things. I think they almost anchor you into doing things in a certain way, in that certain way. I've sometimes found that spreadsheets and other ways of managing it, post-it notes, etc., is much more rewarding when trying to work out the estimates than sticking it and having drop-down boxes in Jira or whatever other tool it is to select the number value that we have to put against each story.
Jira being the wonderful tool that's for agile teams, but doesn't allow any more than one person to work on a ticket.
You can
at
only
one
have one
time.
person allocated, so you have to create you have to split the story into 3 and have the same story attached to different people, or a task.
It only allows one person to be owner, but it doesn't necessarily mean one person can be not working on it at once.
That is true, but you know how these things are interpreted.
Yes,
Exactly.
yes.
I guess the next question I was going to ask is, have you tried t-shirt sizing with business value and all that
That's
sort of
one
stuff?
that we use all the time now to start with, but it's always let's do initial estimates with t-shirt sizes, and then let's break it down into further detail and go into the more number crunching. Once we've worked out t-shirt sizing gives us a very, very high level thing, but it doesn't give us enough detail. We can't work out an end date at that point. But this is obviously in a world where it's not agile, it's not iterative, it's much more. The one that I've sort of learned a little bit about recently, I've been sort of doing some Googling around it as well, is I don't know if any of you have heard the one Alan Page has mentioned a few times on his A/B testing podcast that he uses at Unity, which is the P50, where you only estimate to a 50% level of certainty of when that's going to be delivered. It gives us that threshold of, well, we're only admitting it's going to be 50% certain that we're going to deliver by this date or do this by this date. And it has that whole flexibility around the estimates, but you just put it as a P50 estimate.
Never, but I kind of always caveat my estimates are estimates or forecasts. I generally try and refer to them as. They are not things that you can accept until they get closer and closer to the time.
Yeah, the language we use doesn't always help, does it? Because we talk about like these estimates and people say that it's done, but also they call it a sprint.
Yes.
A sprint after a sprint after a sprint. The language isn't very helpful at all.
It's not.
Sometimes, we make bad English choices.
But I do think that actually, although we use the word estimate, that again, going back to the sort of limit of time, people see it as set in stone. I have to achieve this within a certain time. I'm falling behind, but it's an estimate. And as long as, again, the communication is there as to why things might be taking longer and actually the complexity is too much, so the story point was necessarily wrong in the first place. Again, it's communication are often the main thing, to sort of break down those perceptions that it is time, that it is, that it isn't a forecast and things like that.
People want certainty. It's a bit annoying because, an estimate, if you got from a builder and they came in and went, oh yeah, but your walls weren't straight and your floorboards were rotten, so we know the estimate went up because this and this. You kind of have no choice but to pay, if you see what I mean, or just not get the work done.
You're actually reminding me of a talk that I saw Andrew Brown do at Eurostar. He was specifically talking about estimates that are made by consultancies when they come in and observe something, and they say, actually, if they gave a true estimate, they'd never get the job.
Never get the job, yeah.
So they go in lower, and then they would find
discover
these other
all
things.
these things.
Yeah. And then the job will end up costing more money. And even if the people who are spending the money know that that's the case, they're always going to have to take the lower one. And so, like, the winner is the one who's given the lowest estimate. And even though everyone basically knows that isn't what's going to happen,
Yep.
they'll end up spending more money. What a remarkably stupid world we live in when that is the
stupid
norm.
system. I've been involved in those sort of client, say, negotiations where you had to give estimates and so on, and you had to kind of take out some of the reality to make the estimate better, more palatable, knowing full well what the reality is going to happen because you know the client or the maturity or the processes or something in play, but you have to take it out and put an assumption in instead saying everything will be fine. And obviously that assumption fails pretty much day one. Like you'll get system access within 10 minutes. No, it takes about a week. So you know that your estimates are wrong. It gives you that maneuverability to change things. It's a dangerous thing with getting contracts from people. And you've got to look out for what people are charging you for. See which is the actual real best deal.
And I
This
think
is going back to your spreadsheet, Russell.
yeah.
Oh, don't get me started.
It brings us to a different kind of estimating, really, doesn't it? You know, we've talked very much about estimating in sprints, but you've just touched on, you know, going to a consultancy and asking for an estimate from them. What techniques do you use for creating that estimate or costings?
That was me putting my finger in the air. It depends. So I recently saw a opportunity for something, which was automate 60 test cases. Tell us how much it's going to cost. Literally, there wasn't much more in it than that. You have to do it in our systems. There need to be something away, and you had to come away, and you had to kind of do a proposal for them. You can't do much with that. You can negotiate with them and so on. Best guess is someone already knows what they want and is already proposing it, and it's kind of been worded so badly to enable somebody else to get that opportunity because no one else can accurately estimate that sort of stuff. But there's kind of the top-down approach, bottom-up, but normally it's asking questions, trying to work things out, using experience-based ideas, T-shirt sizing it, comparing it to relative other projects of similar nature. If you've worked with the same client, it's great and easy because you can use your knowledge of that client to do it. You can do 3-point estimation as well, so you can kind of do best case, worst case, average, most likely sort of thing. But, you know, I think I did that recently for one opportunity and the range was ridiculous because there's so little information. So we said, well, the best way to get a more accurate estimate is let's have a further conversation. Let's do a discovery, pay for a discovery, then we can give you more accurate things. Because there's no way you can estimate accurately based on a one-page document of requirements. It just doesn't happen. No one on this earth can give you a good estimate from that.
And there's a case, isn't there, when if you plan everything up front to the nth degree,
Wrong.
it's like when you say once something's published, it's out of date.
A plan never survives the first interaction or something, isn't it? The first shot of battle or something.
I agree with everything you said, but I would also include the element of risk, that highlighting to the client all the risks that are involved with the estimation, because then it gives you a bit of a caveat of you know, we've considered this is what we haven't considered, or we can see it consider it to be a problem with our estimations, and I think that's an important tool to include.
You're right. Dependencies and risks are two of the things so that you can caveat it later.
So there was a reason I asked that particular question, is because I'm about to go into my first owned RFP myself, where I'm looking at new clients for understanding how they get their estimates together is useful to see from that side of the fence as well. But
how would you do it, I guess, is the question, then figure out from there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, now you've said all of that, it's kind of very similar that you would kind of use a mix of things to come together with it.
Generally have conversations to help. If you say, oh, it's going to take 6 months, and the person goes, I was expecting 3.
And that is a crucial part of any estimating process anyway. And that's something, you know, we've touched on the crudeness of story points, but actually your estimates get better the more conversations, the more you learn, the more you deal with the interactions of understanding what the purpose is of what we're doing, what the value is, how we're going to deliver it.
Context.
What skill? Well, yeah, exactly. What skills we have in the team, you know, what tools we have, et cetera, et cetera. And once you get a full picture, then you can give more realistic estimates. But sometimes you're asked for these estimates when you know next to nothing. And therefore the story points are even less valuable at that point.
That, because I was going to say that, is that sometimes, especially in consultancy, the client may not necessarily have a good idea of what's actually happening, which is why they're coming to a consultancy. and actually their perception of the value that they're adding might be far lower than the complexity of the work. So in that case, the estimation again needs to be reflected as to what and set the client's expectations a bit more clearly.
Changing the subject slightly. So let's say you weren't doing story points. Okay, and you were doing time estimates or something else like that. So obviously story points we talked about before being generally combined. Dev, test is what we think should be ideal. Should be whatever it takes to get something to a done, whatever you agree done to be. If you're not doing story points and you're doing something like time, how do you come to an agreement over how long something will take with all these parties involved in it, and making sure that one party doesn't steal more time from the other party and everyone gets their fair share of it? Because I've never had to deal with it in that way, and I'm just curious.
Yeah, we've struggled a bit with that because sometimes our time estimates include both dev and test, and we've always requested that tests be separate, but people will fill their time. They'll see, oh, it's 2 days to fulfill this task as the developer is because they're first, so they fill the 2 days, and therefore the test
There's no time left. Yeah,
there's no time left for the test because the perception of time is I've got all the time that I need, and all that time is mine. They don't necessarily see the
split.
if it isn't split up naturally. So that's always a tricky thing for us.
I've never worked somewhere where they've explicitly used time. It's always been sort of implied. I think from experience where there has been time has been the implied thing. The one thing I've always felt has been the problem has been when there have been individuals who sort of show how they can do everything fast themselves. They can be the superhero who swoops in to fix things and does all these other things and sort of lords their glory over everybody else. That thing is resolved by team ownership of quality and a good team ethic and a good team ethos of everyone is equal parts responsible for getting things across. But switching from that real individualistic mindset to a team mindset is a very tricky thing and probably something for another time.
Thank you for that poignant note there, Chris, at the end. It's time, I think, though, we do move on. So let's wrap this one up. So thank you very much to all our listeners. Thank you once again to our sponsor, Saffron QA. You can find us on all the sort of social media things these days, I think. Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. I forgot what exists these days. Everything you can possibly think of, we're probably there. Is there a new one, Mastodon? Are we on that one yet? Not sure. Maybe watch this space. Who knows? And of course, you can email us at contactus@testingpeers.com. So thank you once again for joining us. We look forward to you listening to us again one day soon.
For now, it's goodbye from the Testing Peers.
Goodbye.